let me start talking about King Cotton and the cotton world, and what your book calls the cotton revolution. In some ways, I've sort of hinted at this briefly in other lectures in the Democracy in America lecture and discussions and in the religion reform discussions. But it's important to put this, and I like the way your American Yop does this, because it puts this chapter right before the chapters on manifest destiny and sectional crisis, which explain why cotton has become so much more important and why the changes in slavery have become so important in the period that eventually lead up to and cause the Civil War. And again, I want to stress a couple of things, and that three things really. First, of course, is I know I've said this a million times, but I know you've been told it a million times from elementary school onwards. The invention of the cotton gin is a major innovation. The invention of the cotton gin suddenly makes cotton so much more cheap and affordable. And of course, cotton turns out to be an absolutely excellent cloth. We tend to forget that things like denim are based on cotton, and one of the things that helps the gold rush and the expansion west is the denim and its durability for rough outdoor work. Okay, this also helps in the South and other places. So cotton becomes king, as they say. It's not just an example of people over focusing on an innovation that then that turns the whole world upside down. I don't want to say that cotton is as important as, for instance, the atomic bomb in terms of world developments, but it almost is. After all, as I'm going to say in a minute, cotton expands the U.S. economy tremendously. The cotton gin especially expands U.S. economy tremendously, and cotton becomes a much stronger worldwide commodity than ever before. And I think it ultimately replaces sugar. The second thing is that you have the invention of steel framed building, so that buildings can be larger buildings and taller buildings can be built on a steel frame, in which the concrete or the bricks or anything are added to the outside, but that the main supporting load is carried by the steel frame. And this is important because it means that you can make higher buildings, because the steel is stronger. It doesn't compress in a sort of compounded way that you try to make a brick skyscraper at only a certain point before it literally gets too heavy and crashes down. Steel framed buildings make that possible. And so what this does is it allows people who make a lot of money to have houses in town, to have businesses in town. It allows for the diversification of assets. And so in addition to the fact that cotton is king, and partly based on the increased money that the cotton is bringing about, it helps make towns actually bigger, and more importantly, it turns also a lot of towns into cities, and a lot of cities into, if you will, mega cities. And the third thing is related to both of these things, and that is, of course, as I briefly mentioned a couple of times, the cotton revolution is very important in the North. Okay, it's not just slave owners and the Southern economy that profit immensely from cotton. Northern mill owners profit immensely from cotton. Okay, so the idea that slavery and anti-slavery become a completely North-South divide by 1840, probably that idea is probably too strong and too unsustainable. Sorry, just close my mail here because it's making noise. It's not the case that everyone in the North was opposed to slavery. It's not the case that everyone in the South was supported slavery. It's a majority, case of majority, but an awful lot of people are making money off in the North from cotton, mill owners certainly, and it's hard for them to think that outside a system where the supply of cotton is coming at them in a certain via a certain way and at a certain price. Okay. So it really, the abolition movement in the North really starts among ideological abolitionists and then gradually builds outwards to include business people. But I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. So so as a phrase I overuse all the time, and my friends always make fun of me. This is a really big deal. Okay. So let me start off with the whole cotton is king idea. Cotton replaces sugar as the world's major crop that is produced by slavery in the 19th century. Okay? And it strengthens American slavery. Three-fourths of the world's cotton supply comes from the United States. Other places like India, where cotton is made, are important, but they are definitely smaller, and they piggyback off the innovations being made in the United States in terms of cotton and in terms of production, in terms of combing the cotton and all that sort of thing, right? It was obviously supplied the textile mills in the North, as I said, but also in Britain. Okay, textile mills in Britain go bananas in terms of the amount of cloth they're able to produce based on slave-based cotton. Now, this is interesting because, of course, as you know, sorry, let me just one more sort of stat here. And as early as 1903, cotton was the United States' most important export. Okay, and by 1860, by the outbreak of the Civil War, it represented half of the nation's exports. Now, remember, the slave trade is abolished by Britain in 1807. Slavery in the British Empire is abolished in 1833 and 1838. It's a sort of complicated process. And the American Constitution allows for the abolition of the slave trade in a certain number of years after ratification. So the slave trade in itself is not the Atlantic slave trade is prohibited, but the trade and sale and trade of slaves within the United States really flourished. Okay, more than 2 million slaves were sold from 1820 to 1860. Okay, if you look at the main district offices in southern cities, for instance, there are offices for slave traders. There are auction blocks. There are sort of warehouses where there are slave auctions. There are public slave markets, all sorts of things. So it becomes a much more sophisticated industry, if you will. It becomes more sophisticated. The slave economy becomes much more sophisticated in the way slaves were dealt with. So slaves also become a commodity in addition to a labor force. Okay? And that's extremely important. And again, I can't stress enough, Northern merchants and manufacturers, they participate in the slave economy. They share in the profits, even though slavery is either not happening in their states or banned in their states. And some of the things we don't think about, some of the things we tend to overlook, some of these forget about because it's kind of detailed, it's kind of nerdy, and it's kind of nerdy in a business sense, is that all kinds of things that might not directly be related to cotton and slavery profit from the overall rise of the cotton economy. Things like shipping of other goods, right, is affected by greatly enhanced banks and banking, insurance, right, factories working on other stuff. It becomes, because cotton is so much easier to in the mills is so much easier to turn into cloth, then all kinds of other things become available, right? So if the screw propeller hadn't been invented, for instance, the shipping industry would still have done very, very well, because cotton all of a sudden made massive sales possible, right? And the production of them. Okay, but now the Southern economy, remember, is different from the North. There are very few large cities in the South. The cities were mainly centers for gathering in cotton and shipping it. New Orleans was really the only significant, the size of any significance, a city of any significant size in the South. It's a large immigrant population, very diverse, constantly overturning with French and Caribbean influence, African influence, on and on and on. So we tend to forget about New Orleans, but it really was this sort of New York of the South, right? It provided a lot of the export, and it was certainly as diverse. But now, the South overall, less than 10% of the nation's manufactured goods are produced in the South. And one of the reasons for this is slavery was very, very profitable for most farmers and for most owners of slaves. Okay, there was no need to diversify into to make a factory making rivets, for instance, which become extremely much more important as the second industrial revolution starts to crank along. Even rivets in denim blue jeans, as you know from all of you wear blue jeans. This started way back when. Slavery and cotton-based slave industry is just too profitable, right? There's no need to go into other things or try other things. Okay, there's a famous scene in Gone with the Wind is an absolutely, as far as historians are concerned, Gone with the Wind's a terrible movie. It not only is historically inaccurate beyond belief, it culturally in the 20th century it reinforced all sorts of crazy notions about what happened to the South and what the Civil War was all about and all that sort of thing. But anyway, I don't want to rant too much about that. We could do a whole class just on history in the movies. What was I saying that? Oh yeah, so in the opening scene of one of the opening scenes of Gone with the Wind, there's a gathering at Tara, the old house with the family the Scarlett O'Hara's family owns, of men who are sitting there talking about the coming of war and how Southerners are going to whip the Yankees because Southern gentlemen are better fighters, so the Southern men are more gallant, Southern men are more courageous, and Southern military tactics are better, or West Point is full of Southerners. Anyway, there's a whole sort of rah about how great the South is in terms of the soldierly fiber of the men involved. But Clark Gable, who plays Rhett Butler in the movies, says, well, yeah, that's fine, but there isn't a single cannon factory in the entire South. Okay? And that's what worries him about the South's prospects during the Civil War. Right? It's perfectly fine to be a gallant cavalry officer, and maybe all these things are true, but that doesn't do much when the North can outproduce you in cannons by 1,000,000 or 1,000 to 1, and you have to get all your cannons from somewhere else. Now, I don't know. This is important. I don't know that it's true there were no cannon factories in the South, but that's the kind of economic difference we're talking about, the kind of industrial difference, the kind of difference in industrial emphasis that's so important. Okay. Now, having said that, there is a very large group of what are known as plain folk in the South. This is 3/4 of Southerners, 3/4 of white Southerners, that is, didn't own slaves. They lived on self-sufficient farms. They weren't really integrated into the market economy. Okay. And that's one of the reasons, that's another reason, in addition to slavery, that the South doesn't develop much industry. Southern farmers are largely I don't want to say their subsistence, but they're self-sufficient in terms of they're growing their own food, but also growing their own food for their own villages and towns. And they're not exporting excess food or profitable amounts of food to other places like they are in the north and increasingly the west. On the other hand, even though three quarters of white Southerners didn't own slaves, the majority of whites supported slavery dramatically. Okay. Now there were some Southerners. Andrew Johnson is an important one from Tennessee, who speak out against the planter elite, speak out against this sort of system, where that seems to be very oldie worldy English nobleman sort of system. But this doesn't get very much purchase with white Southerners. They support the planter elite. They support slavery because of bonds of regional loyalty, because of racism, because of their own kinship ties. Because in theory, they might worry that if slavery were abolished, they would then have to compete not only with other white farmers, but now with a whole new class of black farmers. Right? Now that attitude, that specific attitude that I just mentioned, then really doesn't start to take off until the 1840s. But that's mid 1840s, 1850s. But it does take off and it does intensify. So there's a sort of masterless white class that's very, very big. Now those people also, by the way, make up the vast majority of Confederate soldiers. Eventually, the whole sort of Ashley Wilkes. It was Gone with the Wind figure, and Clark Gable, what's his name, Rhett Butler, image of gallant Confederate officers. You know, those numbers are actually very, very, very small. Now, those people, however, do come, of course, from the planter class. Okay. In 1850, most slave-owning families owned 5 or fewer slaves. Okay, there were fewer than 2,000 families who owned 100 slaves or more. These are the really big ones. These are the Washingtons, the Jeffersons. Well, the descendants of Washington, sons of, the really big Virginia owners, the big Carolina owners. Okay, now ownership of slaves really provided a route to wealth, status, influence. Not only did you have more disposable income, you were already among a higher class of people. Slavery was extremely good, brutal and immoral and all kinds of other things, but extremely good, extremely profitable system. Hang on, I just need to put myself on mute and close the video because I'm going to cough like the devil. Hang on. If you don't have your booster, please get your booster, because even this COVID-esque flu that isn't really COVID is pretty terrible. Okay, so where was I? Now, have this planter elite class is very, very important because they're also they're basically, because they've become very wealthy plantation managers, right? They invest heavily in plantation infrastructure. They manage every detail of the plantation. These, even people like Thomas Jefferson, now they have overseers and accountants and stuff, but they really, they're going through the books. They're paying attention to what's going on their slaves. Some members of their family, sometimes the wives of big planters, were considered to be the nurses, right, for sick slaves. They oversaw, of course, all the domestic servants, and they supervised the plantation when the master was away. So it's very much a family-based organization. When Thomas Jefferson is off in Washington debating whatever, Mrs. Jefferson is running the show, right? Or, well, I shouldn't say that because I don't know that specifically for the Jeffersons, but there is a family member who's the titular head while the master is away. Okay, this is the same case for Madison and all these other people. Okay, it's much more common in New England to be less rich. Adamses, for instance, were not as rich, although very rich, obviously, not as rich, but to have a broader range of managers running their stuff, sort of professional managers running their stuff than in the South. South is very much a family thing. Okay. A kind of, and I don't want to say this because it sounds disrespectful, but it's a little bit in, and there's a reinforcing nature to it. It's a little bit like the mafia, right? You trust your family more than, let's say, a professional manager, even though your family member that you put the hands of the estate into while you're gone might be Fredo. He might be intellectually incapable of running the estate, but he's your family, so you trust that he's going to keep the family interest at heart. So this causes some problems for other problems for slave owners. Okay. The other thing is that these Southern slave owners spend a great deal of their money on material goods. Okay, lavish entertainments, the wealthiest people, lavish entertainments, vacations, hugely elegant mansions. All the mansions that we think, all the big plantation mansions in the South, really were constructed in this period, not the late 18th century. Okay, they were committed to a hierarchical, very agrarian government. They're very paternalistic. They saw their slaves as their slave children in many ways. Now they treat them obviously extremely differently than they treat their own children, but they think of themselves as sort of responsible for their slaves, even though they buy and sell them like other property. Okay, even though a great deal of violence is used by slave owners in order to maintain discipline. Not usually directly by slave owners, but by their overseers, right? And this, of course, is all approved by slave owners, and it's all part of this standard run of that sort of culture. Southern code of honor is very strong. The Southern men sometimes dueled, right? Which even, one of the reasons the Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr duel in the North in New Jersey was so famous, has become so famous, not only because the two very important people were involved, but because it was so odd to have a duel at that late stage in the North. So Southerners, it was still common. Southern women were sort of in this circle of domesticity. They apart from when they had to care for or manage the care of slaves outside the house, that they concentrated mainly on their domestic family duties and that of their extended families. Okay, so the Southern patriarch was the male patriarch for his whole family, but the matriarch was the matriarch for the extended family. Okay, now as I've also mentioned before, the pro-slavery argument becomes very interesting in this period. Remember, before the 1820s, we talked about the founding period and other things like that, the early republic. Slavery is seen as this sort of necessary evil. People wrestle with it intellectually. They don't like it. Jefferson doesn't like it, although he treats his slaves in a terrible fashion. He, at least in theory, is wrestling with it intellectually, doesn't know what to do with it. Well, all of that is gone. By the 1830s, very few Southerners believe that slavery was a necessary evil. They start to think of slavery as the basis of free institutions. It's slavery that allows us to have the free institutions that we white people enjoy, is the argument that they're making. It's slavery that allows us, for instance, allows Thomas Jefferson, for instance, to found the University of Virginia. So it has an ultimate good. And Jefferson doesn't necessarily make that, but people do. Okay. There's a stronger commitment to white supremacy than there was before. There was a biblical sanction of slavery, even though the Bible has these two strands about slavery. One talking about how evil it is, but other talking about how common it is and how slaves have to be obedient to their masters and all that sort of thing. But I think the crucial reason why slavery becomes seen as a positive good in this period is because Southern planter elites believe that slavery guaranteed equality for whites. Okay, when you have slaves working in these menial tasks, doing this manual labor, then you don't have this whole class structure of peasants, of white peasants, right? You have very white, poor farmers, but they are their own independent men, right? That's a huge difference in the sort of Southern conception of what is right and what is wrong. So this is how it becomes this idea for positive good. Now, it doesn't just stay in the South. The idea doesn't just stay in the South. Remember how the government is constituted. The government is constituted on the Virginia Plan. So Southerners have been, since the very Southern states, have been overrepresented in the House of Congress, as in the House of Representatives, and in the Senate since day one, right? Because of the 3/5 clause in terms of the House of Representatives, because that every state has 2 senators, no matter how many people live in it. Okay. Now, this is not universally true. Obviously, New Hampshire's tiny state has 2 senators, so it's obviously overrepresented too. But Southern states are overrepresented a great deal more. This problem only gets much worse as the centuries evolve. So what happens is Southerners take this belief and use that power in the federal government, right, to make sure that American foreign policy and American trade policy, especially, doesn't hurt the cotton industry, okay? Or to that extent, the sugar industry. Okay, this is extremely important, right? It's one of the reasons that slavery is able to last for so long. I didn't quit my email the right way. It's beeping in the background. Okay. Now, what's the other side of it? The other side of it is, of course, abolition. By 1840, slavery was abolished in most of Spanish America and certainly in the British Empire. And abolition in the rest of the Americas influenced how slavery was debated in the U.S. Okay. Pro-slavery advocates argue that, look, yes, the British abolished the slavery in the British Empire, but their sugar economy, that the money they're making off sugar drops dramatically in the 1840s, right? Other cash crops, the money that they're making off other cash crops drops dramatically after the abolition of slavery. And in fact, they argue that one of the reasons why we have what become known as the Hungry 40s, that is the 1840s in Europe, is because the abolition of slavery has led to this paucity of commodities, food commodities. Right? So they say, look, you can talk about abolishing slavery all you want, but we have this perfect example right here at British Empire, and it's not working. Okay, or it's not that it's not working. It obviously worked in the sense that it abolished slavery, but it's hurting the British economy. On the other hand, abolitionists argued that former slaves would have higher living standards, and did have higher living standards in the Spanish American world than the British imperial world, and showed that shows that slavery was working, and in fact that it was actually creating new markets, because you had people in the interior who were having to compete and also purchase on the market because they were now free laborers. Okay, so by 1850, let's say, these are the only places that slavery exists: Cuba, Puerto Rico, Brazil, and the United States. Okay, but still, there's this, there's this strong belief that slavery among white Southerners, slavery and slave owners and white Southerners are the true heirs of the American Revolution, helped by, of course, the fact that the first was it 4 of the first 5 presidents and 5 of the first 7 or whatever it is are or white, or maybe it's 6. Yeah, 5 of the first 7 are white Southerners. It's seen as that was proof that it was a superior system. So this debate goes on and on and on about whether it about the role it plays in the country as a moral and a devising not devising as a moral and desirous choice for a country to have. Now, let me take up the question of what was life for slaves like. Well, I'm skipping over a little bit here, but of course, be taken up in the recorded lecture. Life for a daily slave was almost all daily life for a slave was almost all labor. Okay, and the many types of labor a slave could perform. It didn't just mean working in the cotton fields or tobacco fields. It could mean cutting wood, could be working in mines, could be working on docks in seaports, laying railroad tracks, repairing bridges, stuff like that. You could, in fact, work as a skilled artisan if you had gained certain skills or certain talents. But most slaves worked in the fields. Okay, most slaves worked as farmhands. 75% of women, it's estimated, 90% of men worked as field hands on large plantations. They work in a gang with an overseer. Who, by the way, sorry. Let me just who, by the way, almost universally had to employ very violent means to keep labor going. The Louisiana sugar fields were very harsh. Not only was the labor harsh and the conditions harsh in terms of the weather and the type of work, but that sort of intensified the brutality of overseers. Rice plantations were also bad. To say that things are more intense in Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama, and then sort of get less intense as you move eastward and upward to the north towards the tobacco regions, ultimately the tobacco regions, probably true. It's hard to make those kind of generalizations stick. But for instance, the mortality rate among slaves is much higher in sugar plantations and in rice plantations than in other places. But there are, of course, slaves in cities. There are slaves who are servants, who are cooks, domestic. Some slaves are skilled artisans. Some of them lived on their own. But the way order was maintained by force. And the podcast I'm going to put up for this week explains that extensively. The ways to maintain order: whipping, exploiting division of labor among slaves, giving certain slaves who were more obedient the better jobs, giving them incentives, giving the threat of being sold off away from their families, threatening them with being sold off away from their families if they don't behave or do what they're told. And one of the reasons slavery the maintenance order has to be so violent under the slave system is that slaves never really abandoned desire for freedom or their determination to resist bondage. There's a great deal of resistance all the time by slaves at almost every level. And then there's a crackdown. Okay. And a kind of slave culture, if you will, starts to build, despite, of course, the fact that families are often broken up by sale or punishment or whatever. There's a culture that descends from, that takes some African traditions, right, and melds them with the new Christian traditions when slaves are encouraged to go to church and to build their own. Eventually, some plantation owners build churches for slaves, right, and become Christian, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so it is actually a very, very strong bond, even though, as I say, the threat of sale was very important. A third of all slave marriages in some of the more brutal states were broken by sale. Some children were sold away from their parents. 10% of teenage slaves in the Upper South were sold in the interstate slave trade. So, this idea of not the kindly overseer, but the kindly plantation owner who runs his plantation like a family and respects the family, respects his slave's family, just not true. Okay. Now, as I said, one of the things that this slave culture inculcates, one of these things the slave culture derives, is not only inherited oral traditions from their early descendants, but they take the beliefs in liberty and freedom from a lot of the Christian things that they're being taught. Okay, so they hear about Moses in the Bible, and they think there's a Moses. There could be a Moses coming to free them, right? They what was I going with it? This whole idea of this whole notion that that slavery was unjust, and that the desire for freedom just can't be beaten out of them, and is partly reinforced by the Christianity. So now this leads to, of course, resistance. Now, slaves are slave rebellions, outright rebellions were rare. Obviously, they were, because they were cracked down on immensely. But there are lots of different forms of resistance. There's sort of silent resistance, silent sabotage, breaking of tools, pretending you're sick, doing poor work. Okay, less common was, but more serious forms of resistance, including poisoning the master, arson, sometimes even armed assaults. Poisoning the master wasn't as common as trying to poison overseers, but it did happen. Okay. And of course, there were slaves ran away. Another reason why slave discipline has to be so brutal and so strong is because the ability to run away was always there, and but the threat had to be so severe that people wouldn't, that slaves would, you had to be really desperate to do it. Having said that, okay, 1,000 slaves a year, most historians agree, escape during this period. Most of them escape, of course, from the Upper South. In the Deep South, some fugitive slaves often escape to southern cities, try to blend in with free Black populations. Don't forget, the Fugitive Slave Act is still in force right across the entire country. So until you get to Canada or until you get to the Caribbean, it's quite easy to be caught and returned to your masters. Now, of course, there was the famous Underground Railroad. Now, this is one of these things in history that is probably overemphasized, but it's important to know that it did exist. It was a loose organization of abolitionists, the white abolitionists and African American abolitionists, who helped slaves escape. Now we get the famous sort of headline stories of the headline heroes of Harriet Tubman and people like that. But there were a lot of other members of the Underground Railroad who helped slave escape that are completely forgotten about. For instance, there was a couple named Levi and Catherine Coffin, who lived in Indiana, and more or less founded the best model for the Underground Railroad, and brought many slaves through their Ohio and then Indiana homes. And in fact, there's a town in Indiana, I've forgotten the name of it now, has a museum, has the Coffin House, where they actually ran the Underground Railroad from there. Now, however, let me just say this, right? It's important that I would say 95 to 99% of the houses you see in certain states that are people that the legend has been handed down that they were safe houses on the Underground Railroad. It's just mythology, right? Somebody says it to somebody early on, or someone says something like, this may have been a place or this would have been a good place for escaping slaves to hide. And then 2 generations later, it becomes my family's house, the basement was a safe haven or was a way station on the Underground Railroad. There are this whole part of the country is riddled with such places. But of course, it did exist. But what is more common, however, is slaves more or less constantly kept on the move, and they tried to stay away from towns as much as they could. They escaped on boats. They hid. They escaped on barges. They would sometimes take an owner's horse and carriage and try to escape. And it was a constant attempt, but almost a constant failed attempt. There's hundreds of myths surrounding the Underground Railroad. The numbers of people involved, the number of people who were able to escape. That you may have heard this famous story about quilt codes, where African Americans would hang quilts, wash quilts, and hang them out on the line to dry, and that the quilt had sort of these codes that pictures that sort of explained to slaves who were running away, here's the place where you can start if you go follow the bear north, and this blah 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 blah. Well, that was just made up in the 1980s in a fiction book, but of course that becomes part of the culture. So the Underground Railroad was it's very important. Don't get me wrong. Very important for the people who use it and who escape it. But it was probably more important in terms of morale and keeping alive the belief that there was the potential of freedom someday. Now, let me talk about some actual revolts and escapes. In 1839, a group of slaves collectively seized their freedom while on board a ship called the Amistad, Amistad. There's a movie made about this, which I haven't seen. I mean, it's probably historically inaccurate, but they're able to get to freedom. John Quincy Adams defends them in court, eventually argues that they were stolen from Africa in the first place and should be freed. That actually works. But in other ways, the Fugitive Slave Act is just simply almost impossible avoid it. On the other hand, yeah, for instance, in 1811, there was an uprising on a sugar plantation in Louisiana. Slaves march not northward, because northward just gets worse for people in Louisiana. You go north, you're in Mississippi. You go north, you're in Missouri. You're still in a slave state. So actually, for an awful lot of slaves, going further south was the way to go. So the idea was that slaves on the sugar plantation have they have this uprising and march towards New Orleans, okay, in order to try to get to New Orleans, to mingle with free blacks and to escape that way. Now the Louisiana militia captures them. There's another big slave revolt, or planned one, by a man named Denmark Vesey. Right, he wanted to. He had a sort of wanted to plan to have a rebellion. This is, of course, discovered in South Carolina, and he's exposed and condemned to death and executed. Nat Turner's rebellion is perhaps the most famous. He believed that Nat Turner was a slave preacher. He was a sort of religious mystic. He believed that God had chosen him to lead an uprising, and in 1831. He leads a rebellion, and he and his followers march through Virginia. They attack white farm families. They get 80-ish slaves to join them. 60 whites, right, were killed in this before the militia eventually is put down. Now Turner is captured and executed, and now his was sort of the last large-scale rebellion in the South. But again, like the Underground Railroad, like the Amistad, these things became sort of Turner's rebellion became icons in slave imagination. There was a possibility, right, that some sort of freedom could be attained, or at the very least, continuing to fight against slavery was a way to bring about its ultimate demise. Even if it didn't happen in your own generation, if you were involved in fighting slavery, it could eventually be abolished for your children or grandchildren. On the other side of the coin, of course, Turner's rebellion especially was sort of the crowning thing where people said, oh, well, wait a minute now, we really have to crack down. Virginia, some people in Virginia legislature debated plans for gradual emancipation because they said this is just going to keep happening. Let's go back to the Jeffersonian idea that this needs to die a natural death. We have gradual emancipation. It doesn't go that way. And what happens is the state tightens its grip on slaves by further limiting slaves' rights through a series of laws. So, like I say, slavery gets worse between 1800 and 1860. Okay, by Nat Turner's rebellion, in the aftermath of Nat Turner's rebellion, there's a turning point for the old South. White Southerners really close ranks. They defend slavery more strongly than ever. And they, again, I just can't emphasize this enough. They defend it. Now, don't get me wrong. They're not sitting in a committee thinking about how we're going to defend slavery. Well, let's defend it intellectually in these ways. It built Rome, and let's defend it militarily. These ways, by militias can stop Nat Turner's. These things happen gradually over time, and more importantly, they're sort of gradually inculcated into the Southern white consciousness that this is a good thing and needs to be defended. So slave owners and slave owners are able to attach white supremacy and poor white farmers' feelings about racial supremacy to attach those things together in order to defend slavery, even though most Southerners don't own slaves. So 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, slavery is much more strongly defended than ever before, right? And as you'll see in the podcast I put up, in many ways, the brutality of slavery just increases in this period. So I'm gonna end it there and ask for questions.
I don't have any.
I don't have any either.
Anybody else? Okay, well, your discussion agenda is up for Thursday. So get working on it, and I will see you then. Okay.
Have a good day.
Thank you.